The snowstorm had already buried the valley beneath layers of white silence when the dragon pack finally stopped searching, their cries echoing through the frozen peaks with a grief so raw it cracked the ice beneath their claws. For 3 nights they had scoured the mountains, wings heavy with exhaustion, throats burning from calling out to young that would never answer, because the tracks ended at the avalanche scar where the earth had collapsed without warning. To dragons, loss was rare and devastating, and the disappearance of a single hatchling could unravel centuries of emotional restraint. But this pack had lost 4, swept away by snow and stone before their fires were strong enough to fight the cold. They circled the valley again and again, unwilling to accept the finality the mountains demanded, until even rage gave way to mourning, and they landed among shattered pines to keening silence, pressing their foreheads to the ice in a ritual older than language. That was when something moved where nothing should have lived. At the edge of the storm, a lone human figure staggered forward through knee-deep snow, cloak torn, breath fogging the air in harsh bursts, arms wrapped tightly around for small, glowing shapes pressed to his chest. The dragons rose instantly, grief twisting into lethal fury, flames licking through the blizzard as instincts screamed that a thief stood before them. Yet the human did not run. He fell instead, collapsing to his knees as exhaustion finally claimed him. But even as he fell, his arms tightened protectively, shielding the hatchlings from the cold with his own body. The young dragons were alive, thin, shivering, their fires barely flickering, but alive, nestled against human warmth, claws hooked into fabric as if instinctively refusing to let go. The pack froze, torn between disbelief and instinct, watching as the human looked up at them through frost-lined lashes, fear plain on his face yet overridden by something stubborn and defiant. He did not beg, did not raise a weapon, did not reach for the hatchlings to present them as offering. He only whispered hoarsely into the storm, voice cracking, "They wouldn't stop crying. I couldn't leave them." As if that alone explained why a human had walked into death to carry dragon young back from it. And in that moment, as snow settled onto scorched ice and the hatchlings' fires steadied against a human heartbeat, the dragon pack realized with terrifying clarity that what stood before them was not a thief, not a hunter, but something far more dangerous to their old understanding of the world. A human who had chosen compassion over survival, and whose choice had already changed everything. The pack did not strike, though every instinct demanded it, because the hatchlings shifted at the sound of their parents' wings, stirring weakly and pressing closer into the human's chest as if that warmth were the only constant they recognized. Snow hissed and melted where dragonfire touched the ground, yet none of it was directed at the man kneeling in the storm, and that restraint alone marked a fracture in tradition that none of the elders could ignore. Slowly, carefully, the matriarch stepped forward, her massive frame lowering until her shadow fell over the human, steam rising where her heat met the freezing air, and she inhaled deeply, searching for the stench of blood, fear sweat, or deception, but found only exhaustion, frostbite, and the unmistakable scent of prolonged proximity without harm. The human swayed as he tried to stand, legs numb and useless, and one of the hatchlings whimpered, its tiny flame sputtering, and without thinking the man shifted his cloak tighter, sacrificing what little insulation he had left to cover the young instead. That single, unconscious motion ended the question of intent more decisively than any words could have. The matriarch touched the smallest hatchling with the tip of her snout, and felt its fire stabilize, responding not to dragon heat but to the steady rise and fall of a human breath, and the realization cut through her grief with shocking clarity. This human had not merely rescued them, he had replaced the warmth they could not generate themselves. The pack moved then, not to kill but to shelter, wings lowering to form a barrier against the storm, their bodies creating a pocket of calm in a world of ice, and within that circle the human finally collapsed fully, consciousness slipping as the last of his strength gave out. They carried all 5 of them back to the caverns, dragons and human together, because leaving him behind after what he had done felt wrong in a way even ancient law could not justify. When the human awoke hours later beside a geothermal vent, bandaged with crude but careful precision, the hatchlings slept in a pile beside him, and the pack watched silently from the shadows, no longer crying for their lost young, but standing guard over the stranger who had brought them home. In the quiet that followed, a truth settled uneasily among the dragons. They had always believed humans survived by cunning and numbers, Yet this one had walked alone into a blizzard for creatures that could one day burn him alive, and that choice, irrational, costly, and utterly human, had carved a place for him among them that force never could. When the human finally regained full awareness, it was not fear that claimed him first, but sound, the deep, resonant breathing of massive creatures nearby, layered with the softer crackle of controlled flame and the faint, familiar whimpering chirrs of the hatchlings he had carried through the storm. He lay still, body aching as if every joint had been filled with ice and broken glass, aware that any sudden movement might be interpreted as threat. Yet one of the small dragons sensed his wakefulness and immediately scrambled clumsily onto his chest, curling up with a relieved trill that sent a ripple of heat through him. That sound alone shifted the atmosphere of the cavern. The dragon pack emerged fully from the shadows, their forms immense against the stone, eyes bright with intelligence rather than rage, and the matriarch stepped forward again, this time not as a judge but as a presence bearing weight and expectation. Communication came not in words but in pressure, heat, posture, the careful lowering of a massive head to meet the human's gaze without looming dominance, and slowly, haltingly, understanding formed on both sides. The human, whose name was Elias Ward, explained in broken phrases and exhausted gestures how he had found the hatchlings buried in a drift near a collapsed ravine, their cries almost lost beneath the wind, how he had dug with bare hands until his fingers bled, how he had wrapped them in his own coat knowing full well it meant risking his life because leaving them there felt like a death sentence he could not accept. He spoke not as a hero but as someone still baffled by his own choices, and the dragons listened, absorbing not just the facts but the emotional intent behind them, something their kind rarely articulated but deeply understood. Over the days that followed, Elias remained within the cavern complex as the storm raged on, recovering slowly while the pack observed him with a mixture of vigilance and curiosity, noting how the hatchlings responded to him instinctively, how their fires burned steadier when he was near, how they slept more deeply pressed against his side than when returned to the heat of their brood alone. This unsettled the elders because dragon young were meant to anchor to the pack, not an outsider, yet the evidence of survival was undeniable. The hatchling scales regained luster, their breathing normalized, and the lingering cold sickness that should have claimed them faded entirely. Debate followed in low, rumbling tones that echoed through the stone, arguments between tradition and outcome, fear and fact, until the matriarch silenced them with a single flare of controlled flame and made a decision that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Elias would be allowed to stay until his strength returned, and more than that, he would be allowed contact with the young, not as a keeper, not as an owner, but as what the dragons reluctantly began to understand as a stabilizing presence. The days turned into weeks, and in that time an unexpected routine emerged, one shaped by necessity rather than intent. Elias repaired harnesses, reinforced stone supports damaged by ice, and improvised tools to redirect geothermal warmth more evenly through the nesting chambers, applying the same practical problem-solving he had once used in a human village now half-buried by winter. Dragons watched, puzzled but attentive, as he worked without complaint, never demanding reward or recognition, stopping only when exhaustion forced him to rest, at which point the hatchlings invariably piled onto him as if guarding him in return. Through observation alone, the pack began to grasp something subtle yet profound, that humans did not merely endure hardship through strength, but through adaptation, through the willingness to change approach rather than escalate force, and that this trait, placed near dragon young, did not weaken them but broaden their responses to the world. The shift was not immediate, nor was it universally welcomed. One of the older males challenged Elias's presence openly, flaring aggressively until the human froze, instinctively shielding the hatchlings with his own body without conscious thought. That reflexive act, placing fragile flesh before dragonfire, ended the confrontation more decisively than violence ever could, because it forced the elder to confront a reality no threat display could erase. This human valued the young above his own survival. After that, resistance faded into wary tolerance, then into something approaching respect. When spring finally broke the valley open and the snow began to recede, Elias prepared to leave, fully expecting to be escorted out and never permitted to return. Yet the matriarch halted him at the cavern mouth, lowering her head so that one vast eye met his, and made it clear through gesture and presence that his path forward did not require disappearance. He could go, but the bond he had formed was acknowledged, and the hatchlings, now stronger and more confident, would remember him. As Elias descended the mountain toward a world that had no idea what had changed above it, the dragon pack watched in silence, no longer mourning their lost young, but contemplating a future in which survival did not demand isolation, and where a single human choice, made in a snowstorm without witnesses, had rewritten the boundaries between fire and flesh forever. When Elias returned to the mountains the following winter, he did not expect to survive the climb, and he certainly did not expect to be welcomed. Yet neither fear nor hope was what drove him upward through the snow. It was responsibility, the quiet kind that settles after you realize your life has brushed against something larger and cannot pretend it did not happen. He carried no weapons, only supplies and crude tools, because he had learned the hard way that force had no language dragons respected, while intention did. The storm was lighter than the year before, but the cold cut deeper, and by the time he reached the outer ridges his hands were already numb, breath burning his lungs as memories of that first rescue threatened to overwhelm him. He did not call out, did not announce himself, trusting instead that if the pack wished him gone, they would make that clear without ambiguity. The signal came not as threat, but as presence, shadows moving above the cloud line, wings carving patterns in the falling snow, familiar silhouettes that sent a pulse of relief through his chest. The matriarch landed ahead of him, massive and controlled, snow hissing into steam around her claws, and for a long moment they simply regarded one another. Two beings from incompatible worlds bound by an event neither could undo. She allowed him passage, and that permission alone confirmed what Elias had suspected for months. The bond had not faded with distance. Inside the caverns, the changes were unmistakable. The hatchlings, no longer truly young, approached him without hesitation, larger now, their scales brighter, their fires disciplined in a way that would have once taken decades to achieve. They did not cling as before, but they did press close, brushing against him in greeting, and the pack allowed it without correction. What followed was not ceremony, but conversation of a different kind. Shared labor, mutual observation, gradual understanding, because dragons did not grant trust through words, but through repeated exposure to consistent behavior. Elias helped reinforce new nesting chambers designed with both airflow and structural stability in mind, introducing simple principles of load distribution and thermal regulation that the dragons adapted with startling speed, integrating them into their own ancient designs. In return, the pack allowed him to observe training sessions, where young drakes practiced controlled flame projection under conditions that emphasized restraint rather than dominance, a philosophy that would have been unthinkable before the avalanche year. The elders still argued, still worried that this path led toward dependency or dilution of tradition, but those concerns weakened each time evidence contradicted them. Injuries decreased, accidental flare incidents dropped sharply, and young dragons demonstrated greater adaptability when faced with unfamiliar terrain or stressors. The shift extended beyond the pack itself, rippling outward when neighboring broods noticed the difference, not in posture or aggression, but in survival rates and recovery after disaster. Curiosity replaced suspicion, and soon emissaries arrived, observing quietly, asking cautious questions, measuring outcomes rather than defending ideology. Elias never positioned himself as a teacher, because he understood that dragons rejected instruction but respected example, and so he focused on doing, repairing, stabilizing, listening, allowing conclusions to form without coercion. When a late-season quake destabilized part of the mountain, it was the dragons raised under this new balance who responded first, coordinating with Elias instinctively, using controlled heat to reinforce stone while following his shouted guidance on stress points, preventing a collapse that would have buried half the nesting grounds. That moment became impossible to dismiss. The matriarch called a gathering not just of her own pack but of others who had watched from afar, and there, beneath vaulted stone and glowing vents, she acknowledged what had changed. That strength tempered by understanding was not weakness, and that survival no longer required dragons to stand alone against the world. Elias was not elevated, not named, not bound by oath, but he was recognized as proof that humans were not merely unpredictable hazards, but potential anchors capable of grounding fire rather than provoking it. When he eventually descended the mountain again, older, slower, but carrying the same quiet resolve, the dragons did not follow him with fear or dependency. They followed him with trust, escorting him to the edge of their domain before turning back, secure in the knowledge that the bond would persist without constant proximity. Long after Elias's footsteps vanished into snow and time, the story endured, passed among dragons not as a tale of rescue, but as a lesson carved into instinct. That grief does not have to end in rage, that compassion can interrupt even ancient cycles of loss, and that the world had changed forever the moment a human emerged from the snow carrying what fire itself had failed to protect. By the time Elias Ward became a story rather than a presence, the mountains themselves seemed to remember him, holding his name in wind patterns and snowbreaks long after his tracks faded for the final time. Dragons measure time differently than humans do, yet even by their reckoning, the changes that followed were rapid, almost unsettling, because they did not spread through conquest or decree, but through imitation. Packs that had once scoffed at the matriarch's tolerance began quietly adopting the same practices after observing undeniable results. Hatchlings exposed early to calm, non-threatening human presence showed fewer volatile flare-ups, bonded more evenly within their packs, and recovered faster from injury and loss. This did not make them weaker. On the contrary, when conflict arose, whether from rival packs, territorial beasts, or environmental catastrophe, these dragons responded with precision rather than fury, conserving strength instead of exhausting it. The old assumption that grief must harden into rage began to crack, because the avalanche year proved something heretical to dragon tradition. Mourning did not have to end in destruction. When Elias finally died, peacefully, in a lowland settlement far from the peaks, the dragons knew before any human messenger reached the mountains. The hatchlings he had saved, now massive drakes with wingspans that darkened valleys, felt the absence like a sudden drop in temperature, a hollow where warmth had once anchored them. They did not roar or burn cities in grief, as ancient instinct might have demanded. Instead, they flew. They crossed snowfields and forests and rivers until they reached the place where his body rested, circling high and silent, a vigil so restrained that humans watched without panic, sensing instinctively that this was not a threat but a farewell. No fire touched the ground that day. No monument was demanded. When the dragons departed, they left behind something subtler and more enduring, a pattern of behavior that humans would later recognize as intentional mercy. In the years that followed, dragon-human encounters shifted across entire regions. Where once patrols armed themselves expecting annihilation, now they prepared protocols for stillness, signaling, and withdrawal, understanding that escalation was no longer inevitable. Dragons, in turn, began treating isolated humans not as trespassers by default but as unknowns, beings whose actions mattered more than their species. The story of the Mourning Pack and the man from the snow was taught to dragon young not as legend but as warning and guidance. If a creature risks itself for your fire when it gains nothing in return, you owe it restraint. Over generations, this lesson rewired instinct itself. Dragons still defended territory, still burned when threatened, still ruled the skies with undeniable power, but they no longer mistook grief for justification. The world did not become gentle, nor safe, nor equal, yet it became survivable in ways it had never been before, because one human had interrupted a cycle that even dragons believed immutable. HFY was never carved into banners or sung as triumph. It lived instead in quiet outcomes, in cities that still stood, in valleys not scorched, in young dragons who learned that strength included the ability to choose not to destroy. And long after Elias Ward's name blurred into history, the mountains kept their own record, etched not in stone but in behavior, proving that sometimes the most powerful thing a human can do is step into a storm, refuse to look away from suffering, and carry the future back with numb hands and an open heart. As centuries unfolded, the consequences of that single winter rescue reached farther than any dragon or human alive at the time could have imagined, shaping not just behavior, but identity itself. Dragons began to recognize a quiet divide between those who carried the old instincts untouched and those whose lineage traced back, directly or indirectly, to the avalanche year, and the difference was not in strength or size, but in choice under pressure. When threatened, the latter hesitated just long enough to assess, to read intent, to remember that not every unfamiliar presence required annihilation, and that pause alone altered the outcomes of countless encounters. Humans, for their part, learned to interpret dragon behavior with a nuance that replaced blind fear. Settlements near dragon territories trained scouts not to provoke. Farmers learned seasonal flight patterns, and emergency signals were standardized to communicate distress without aggression. None of this emerged from treaties or rulers. It spread because it worked, because fewer people died, fewer valleys burned, fewer broods mourned. The story of Elias Ward became a cornerstone example in both cultures, though it was told differently. Humans emphasized the sacrifice, the frozen hands, the walk into the storm, while dragons emphasized the restraint that followed, the decision not to kill when killing would have been easy. Over time, mixed response groups formed organically, human engineers, medics, and guides working alongside dragon responders during avalanches, volcanic shifts, and forest fires. Each species covering the other's blind spots, each trusting the other's limits. Critics on both sides never fully disappeared, but their arguments lost weight with every generation that grew up seeing cooperation as normal rather than exceptional. The mountains themselves became shared spaces rather than borders, respected rather than contested, and even when conflict arose, it ended more often in withdrawal than escalation. In the deepest caverns, elders still told the young about the days when grief led only to flame and ruin, not to glorify them, but to remind them how close the world had once been to permanent fracture. And in those lessons, Elias was never called a savior or a hero. He was described simply as the human who did not turn away, because that choice mattered more than any strength he lacked. HFY endured there, not as supremacy, not as conquest, but as reputation, earned slowly, reinforced under stress, and remembered because it reshaped instinct itself. In the end, the greatest legacy of the Mourning Pack was not that their young survived, but that their survival taught two species how to carry loss without letting it burn the world down, proving that sometimes the future hinges not on who is strongest in the storm, but on who is willing to walk into it with open arms and refuse to let go.